I'm Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. I worked on the first carbon offset project 35 years ago and have been working in the field ever since. My company took the first client carbon neutral 25 years ago, Stonyfield Farm Yogurt, and it wasn't with junk offsets. You may have seen this recent headline. I've seen hundreds of these headlines over the years. And in this video, I want to explore what buyers and investors in particular ought to be doing to try and get past some of these headlines and to make actual progress on climate change with carbon offsets. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about the carbon offsets conversation is that it's been going on for a long time. And we've been talking about the same things, basically, during that entire period. And to give you a very specific example of that, I pulled out this slide from a 2008 PowerPoint, and this slide discusses some of the controversies around carbon offsets. There's additionality, there's permanence, there's the lack of sustainable development benefits, there's the impact on local communities, there's the moral hazard for environmental rulemaking. All of these issues are still being discussed today. In most cases, exactly the same issues. In most cases, exactly the same arguments and the same conversations over and over again. So let me give you just a very quick history of carbon offsets. 1988 was first carbon offset, happened to be an agroforestry project in Guatemala, implemented by the CARE Relief Agency and paid for by AES, a small power producer. Voluntary markets grew rapidly during the 1990s. We started to really see the commoditization of offsets in the early 2000s. We heard a lot about how it was no longer a Wild West, that the problems with offset markets had been fixed and that you could trust offset markets. We started seeing offsets really promoted as investments. We even saw cold calling where people would be calling retired people and saying, you should add carbon offsets to your portfolio because they're going to continue going up in price indefinitely. That was being done pretty commonly in 2008, for example, just before the entire market collapsed in 2009. And after that, sort of what I call round one of carbon offset started to come to a close. Companies were getting tired of the headlines like the one that I just showed you. And they started to say, look, we'll focus on internal reductions. We'll focus on energy efficiency. We don't want to keep getting beat up over carbon offsets. And so for a while, it looked like carbon offsets, especially in the voluntary context, might fade away. But then with net zero and the whole idea of needing to get to net zero globally and having that translated into corporate net zero commitments that inevitably required huge numbers of carbon offsets, suddenly carbon offsets were back. And that's what I call round two of carbon offsets. And what we're hearing is that it's no longer the Wild West, that we fixed the problems with carbon offsets. Offsets are being promoted as an investment because the price of offsets is going to increase indefinitely. What's really new about the carbon offsets round two conversation is that suddenly it's being put forward, or carbon offsets are being put forward as or as a critical part of the solution to climate change. And that's a change because no one really was talking that way during carbon offsets round one. The real question is, will round two end differently from round one? And if you think it will, the question is, why? Because the fundamental issue that we've always faced with carbon offsets is that we're trying to do two things with offsets. We're trying to reduce the costs of mitigation, the costs of compliance. We're trying to contain mitigation costs, and we're trying to accomplish climate change mitigation benefit. You can't maximize for both of those variables at the same time. And this has been a fundamental tension in carbon markets, voluntary and regulatory, since the beginning of carbon offsets time. And it continues to be today. Nothing has changed in terms of this inherent tension. And it basically undermined round one. And will it undermine round two? Very possibly. It doesn't help that carbon offsets are such a strange commodity. And I like this quote from journalist Mark Shapiro as a way of explaining what's strange about this commodity. That unlike traditional commodities, which at some point during the course of their market exchange must be delivered to someone in physical form, the carbon market is based on the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. Now, that's not to say that you can't build a successful carbon offset market, but it does help point to the fact that it's going to be hard, and there are all kinds of ways that it could go wrong. And many years ago, I actually made this point at a conference of the parties where I discussed the fact that as we set carbon offset policy, we tend to forget that there are 1,000 very smart people in the room next door just waiting to game whatever those policies are. And that goes for climate policies in general, but it certainly goes for market mechanisms and carbon offsets. And people will try to game the system to their own advantage. And so unless the rules are really written in a way that takes that into account, you're going to have the kinds of problems with offset markets that we've seen for a long time. So if round two is going to be different, for one thing, we have to tackle some of the difficult issues that we've been talking about for decades. And they are difficult issues. There is no technical fix to these issues. And most people don't really understand the challenges of dealing with additionality, of dealing with permanence, of dealing with leakage. And until you really understand those issues, we're not going to get to the next level in terms of mitigating climate change with carbon offsets. And buyers and investors in particular have to take responsibility for what they're buying. You simply can't go out and buy the cheapest thing available and then say, I've done my bit, when everyone understands today that buying the cheapest thing available is probably not generating a lot of climate change mitigation benefit. And so I think we have to get accustomed to the fact, especially if you're spending millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars on carbon offsets, there should be serious due diligence involved. And it's not just due diligence with the idea of being a climate hero and getting to net zero. It's due diligence because there are real risks involved here, and those risks are going to increase. There's brand risk, there's potential liability risk, there are other potential risks, and companies today simply can't say they're unaware of these risks because they've been around now forever, and they're on the front page of lots of websites almost on a daily basis. And so I'm going to close with some discussion of how the climatographers can help with this objective. If we're going to use carbon offsets, how can companies take responsibility and do the due diligence that needs to be done? And we have a number of ways that we can help. We've built the Climate Web, which is a collective intelligence for climate change and includes pretty much everything you could ever want to know about carbon offsets. We've done courses on carbon offsets that have been very well received. We can help you build instantly a turnkey carbon offsets knowledge base that you can turn into your own knowledge management system for carbon offsets, or we can actually help you do a SWOT analysis for an offset that you're considering buying or for your offset portfolio. We can actually use the Climate Web and use our 30 years of experience to help you very quickly and cost effectively do the kind of SWOT due diligence that really is desperately needed today. So here are some links you can use. Theclimateweb.com goes to the Climate Web's general website. Climatecourses.climatesites.net lets you see what our courses are and how you can get access to them. If you want to see a PowerPoint deck that focuses and that explores the Climate Web in more detail, go to climatewebdeck.climatesites.net for an offsets deck specifically and the kind of information you can get as part of a turnkey knowledge management system. Go to offsetsdeck.climatesites.net. And if you want more information on the idea of SWOT support, SWOT analysis around offsets that you're buying or that you've already bought, go to offsetswot.climatesites.net. If you have any interest in climate change, knowledge management, the topics that we're talking about in this video, join the Climate Web Club. You'll see a link to the Climate Web Club in any of the decks and the sites that I've just pointed you to. If you have questions, if you want to discuss a SWOT analysis, you can always contact me through my email. Thanks for watching.